Vickers Viscount is one of my favorite aircrafts, and we're going to take you on a flashback journey back to the 1950s and the 1960s to show you some of the operators, the airlines that operated this amazing classic British propliner. By way of a quick summary on the Vickers Viscount, it was a four-engine Rolls-Royce Dart-powered airliner that was developed in the late 1940s and early 1950s. And its turbine comfort brought a new era of range, comfort, and speed that far surpassed the capabilities of the piston engines that it replaced. With each airline that we see, I'm going to only have a short period of time, so I'm going to share with you a short tidbit before I move on to the next operator. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the journey. This is a Kuwait Airways 700, probably taken in Athens, operated through the mid-1960s. Cubana were ordered underneath Fidel Castro. This is seen at Miami, early 60s. Cyprus Airways leased an example from BEA in the late 1960s and early 70s. This is a Aeropostal Venezuela 700 taken at Caracas, probably in the early 1970s. Very rare Colombian Viscount 800 Urraca taken in the 1970s. BEA Channel Island Viscounts 800 seen probably at Gatwick, early 70s. Scottish Airways division, probably seen up in Newcastle in the early 1970s. Again, another Venezuelan. This is an Aeropostal 700 at Caracas in the 1960s. This is Aloha. They had several Viscount 700s through the 1960s. Lufthansa had a fleet of Viscount 800s from the late 50s until the late 60s. BEA had a huge fleet of Viscount 700s and 800s. And of course, this is one of their 800s taken in the 70s when it was absorbed by British Airways. VOSP, taken at Santos Dumont Airport, Viscount 800. They operated until the early 70s. This is Aer Lingus. They had a large fleet through the 1960s, Viscount 800. And here's another shot of a Viscount 800. This one's leased from KLM, taken in the 60s in Dublin. Icelandair operated several Viscount 700s, taken in the 60s. Cambrian, independent British carrier Cambrian, Viscount 700, Heathrow, 1960s. Turkish Airlines had a fleet of 700s. They served Amsterdam in the 60s. And this is the interior shot of an Air Canada TCA Viscount, 1960s. British Airways, Viscount 800, they operated until about 1980. And here we have a BEA Viscount 800 at Paris, sometime in the 1960s. Beautiful scheme there. Pluna Airways operated the Viscount 800 through the 1970s. On the River Plate run, Aldair, this is a Viscount 800, former British Airways in the mid-1970s. Very popular in Indonesia, this is Merpati, Viscount 800. San Colombia also operated Viscount 800s from the 1960s through the 1970s. Here we have a New Zealand National Airways Viscount 800. They operated from the 60s to the 70s. Royal Swazi operated this one example in the 1970s, probably taken at Joburg. This is a very rare Charlie Rich rock band charter Viscount 700 in the 70s. Another Merpati Viscount 800, probably taken in about 1974. British Eagle Airways operated this Viscount seen at New York. It went down to the Caribbean, to Bermuda. Air Rhodesia had a very impressive Viscount 700 fleet in the 1960s and 70s. Aeropostal Viscount 700 in the 1960s. Stunning shot of an Aer Lingus Viscount 800 taken somewhere in the UK in the 1960s. Wonderful shot of British Air Service, BKS, from Newcastle, Viscount 800. And of course, the US-based Capital Airlines, which merged into United in the early 1960s, had a very sizable fleet. Sayeta Viscount 700, taken in Ecuador in the 1960s. And this is another lovely Aer Lingus shot in the late 1960s scheme. I don't know where that's taken. Invicta, British UK independent, Viscount 700, circa 1964. And a lovely shot of KLM's Viscount 800 taken at Amsterdam in the early 1960s. Here we have a British United Viscount 800 in the late 60s, taken in Rotterdam. And another Cambrian shot, most likely taken over in Rotterdam as well, 1960s. This is an Aldair Viscount 800 from the 1970s. They were UK-based. Alitalia had a fleet of Viscount 700s from the 1950s until the late 60s. British Midland was a huge operator of the Viscount. This particular one is an early 700 from the 60s. Ghana Airways of Ghana had a Viscount 800 in the 1960s. Air India's Domestic Indian Airlines operated a 700 fleet in the 1960s. And of course, Aeropesca of Bogota, Colombia purchased their Viscount fleet from Aloha in the early 1970s. Basel Airport, British Midland Viscount, circa 1974. And Lufthansa in the late 1960s color scheme of Lufthansa, which was popular until the 1990s. This is a former United Airlines Viscount from the early 70s. Continental was another American operator which operated the Viscount. This is a 800 taken at an air show in the 60s. Capital Airlines Viscount 700, possibly at Midway Airport, late 50s. WIA, British West Indies, operated a Viscount 700 seen at Miami. And here we have an Aer Lingus Viscount 800 at Heathrow, circa 1962. Back to South America, VOSP, Sao Paulo, 1962 circa, and Air Canada had a huge fleet. This is beautiful, taken at Vancouver in the mid-1960s. SATA of Switzerland operated this 800 on charters. The Viscount 800 was popular and big in Japan through to the 1960s. Here we have another Indonesian operator, Merpati. They lasted through until the 1990s, believe it or not. And another shot of SATA's 800 doing an IT charter down to the Canaries. Here we have a beautiful shot of Eagle Airways, British Eagle Airways in New York, 1959. And here we are, of course, back in South America, back in Bogota with Aeropesca and their ex-Aloha. Another gorgeous shot of a Lufthansa early 60s Viscount 800. It looks fantastic. Continental Airlines, probably taken in San Francisco, I'm thinking, but not sure. It's looking gorgeous. Condor was the charter subsidiary of Lufthansa, hence the Lufthansa color scheme, 1960s. Very rare. This is a Lao Airlines Viscount 800. I'm not sure if it was ever delivered. United Airlines Viscount 700s. These were gorgeous, taken in Chicago. Trans-Canada Airlines, Boston, circa early 1960s on a snow-covered ramp. This is a fabulous shot of a British Midland Viscount 800, 1972. Cambrian, looking gorgeous, from Wales. Wow, 1972. Merhaba, hoş geldiniz. Türk Hava Yolları Viscount, looks like it's taken in Paris, 1960s. British United Charter Machine from about 1963. They were short-lived. And South African Airways, taken probably in Joburg in the early 1960s. British Eagle from London, probably taken at Heathrow, circa late 50s. Well, I really hope you enjoyed this fantastic journey. I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank our friends over at airlinefan.com. If you're interested in many of these cool images that you saw, a lot of them came from the airlinefan.com website, where you can actually embed these images in your website or use them in your journalistic endeavors if you're an aviation writer. Also, if you collect aviation images, you can purchase a color photo or a digital image of many of these images. So thanks a lot to the guys at Airline Fan. Sit back, relax, and we'll look forward to seeing you on our next exciting classic airline journey. If I was able to help you out or entertain you with this video, please give me a like, comment, or subscribe in the lower corner right there. Thank you very much.